pleasure tonight to start one of two travelogues that will be about Boston and with special guests from Boston. The National Parks of Boston is really a small collection of important historic sites, about an hour on a good day from where we're sitting right now. Megan Woods is our guest speaker tonight. She is part of the Student Conservation Association Public History Internship at the National Parks of Boston. We had the pleasure of touring Megan around Lowell last year to show her a bit of what women's history looks like in this neck of the woods, and she's going to honor us tonight by sharing some of her research about the Charlestown Navy Yard. Gabby Hornbeck, her colleague, is going to give us a full introduction on what she'll talk about, but just to get us started and to kind of set the frame for the series is the reason we do this is it's a dialogue about travel, and it's also a way for us to connect national park stories that might not seem to have a lot of connective tissue when we first think about them. The topic that Megan will be describing for us tonight and really exploring in a depth that hasn't been done before, a lot of this is really new research, is looking at the women workers of the Charlestown Navy Yard and focusing specifically on issues of race and politics of discrimination. Part of what's so important and where this really connects with our story here in Lowell is with both Lowell's story and women workers of World War II. We often have these kind of casual phrases about it being the first time that women were working. And that's not true. We know based on domestic labor and longer, more complicated stories about women's work that it's all just how we value and who we value when we talk about women's work. So Megan is going to be taking that story about the we can do it and the kind of propaganda of World War II and looking more deeply into what that story really looks like at one place. That's going to probably also help us think about what's our work story in Lowell and how does that change over time? So Gabby is going to give us a great introduction of how they connect at the park. So let's welcome her to Lowell.
Thank you so much, Allison. So I'm just here to provide a brief introduction for the main attraction, which is, of course, Megan. But as Allison said, my name's Gabby Hornbeck. I'm a park guide with the Visitor Engagement, Education, and the Arts Directorate at Boston National Historical Park, which is a unit of the National Parks of Boston, so a lot of hierarchical categories there. But to talk a little bit about Megan, since June of 2019, my colleagues and I have been acting as mentors to support our wonderful SCA intern, Megan Woods. A little bit about her background. After graduating from Northeastern University with her master's in public history and a graduate certificate in the digital humanities, she began working with us, researching and reconstructing stories that have really yet to be told within the context of the National Parks of Boston. Today we'll be hearing from Megan regarding her continuing research project on the Great Migration in the Charlestown Navy Yard. And we're incredibly proud of the work that she's put into the project thus far and know that she's going to produce some incredible tangibles, resources that visitors and park stewards alike will benefit from for generations to come. So at the end of the program, please feel free to ask any questions. I know she's going to keep some time at the end in order to do so. And we also do have some both literature from our park sites as well as some business cards for her as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan.
I acknowledge that many historical institutions were founded upon exclusion and erasures of many indigenous peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. So my talk is From Migration to Discrimination. So at the turn of the 20th century, many Southern African Americans felt Jim Crow laws strengthening around them. This implementation of discriminatory laws attempted to solidify African Americans' place as second-class citizens and heightened racial terror. Many Southern blacks lived within this system set before them, finding ways to resist and fight back. However, many others took a different path. They heard of the growth of northern cities and industries that were in desperate need of individuals to fill the workforce. Some African Americans made their way north, seeking a better life that would provide them with economic advancement and an escape from the discrimination and terror in the South. This movement of African Americans is known as the Great Migration. And I've been trying to understand how this national social and demographic shift affected Boston, specifically at the Charlestown Navy Yard. While employment at the Navy Yard did provide some African Americans with new economic opportunities, was it also the escape from discrimination they desired? This question has proven to be very complex, and I don't have a concrete answer. But in an attempt to grapple with this question, today we're going to look into the experiences of 3 African Americans, J. Henry Strickland, Helen Franklin, and Isaac Cummings, who all worked at the Navy Yard and faced discrimination. We will learn how these 3 workers confronted this injustice and see what else their stories reveal about the Great Migration and race discrimination at the Charlestown Navy Yard. So before we can dive into the experiences of these African American workers at the Charlestown Navy Yard, let's set the stage with the Great Migration's influence on Boston. So comparing Boston's Black population to that of other cities in the North and in the Midwest in the first half of the 20th century, we see that Boston had a very slow population growth, whereas other cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago had a dramatic increase, in large part due to the Black Southerners making their way north. So why did the Great Migration influence Boston less than other cities at the beginning of the 19th century? That answer is unclear. It could be because people making their way up the coast stopped at other cities like Philadelphia or New York and never made their way to Boston. Or it could be because the conservative politics of the city led to limited economic growth, so the opportunities available weren't as appealing as those in other cities. We should remember that this journey was already long and expensive to get to New York and other mid-Atlantic cities. So just imagine how much more strength and drive an individual needed to continue even further north. Regardless of these obstacles, it's important to remember that this demographic shift clearly still affected Boston. There were still thousands of Southern Blacks who came to Boston tired and frustrated with the inequality and discrimination they faced in the South, and they looked for economic stability and a better social climate. Many of them turned to family members, Black community members, and local Black organizations in Boston for help as they settled down in this city to begin a new life. While some Southern Blacks found jobs in the railroad industry or the domestic sphere, others saw the defense industry's need for a strong workforce, especially during the World Wars. Now, with World War II, the Charlestown Navy Yard increased its shipbuilding production, which required more civilian workers. At this time, the Navy Yard began hiring women and more African Americans, both men and women, to aid the war effort. While there is no link or recruitment effort directly connecting Southern Black workers with fulfilling the needs of the Charlestown Navy Yard, the Navy Yard may have been one of the places Southern African Americans looked for employment, since it was in need of workers. Now, we don't know the exact number of African Americans who worked at the Charlestown Navy Yard. At the end of 1944, the Navy Yard employed just over 2,200, quote, non-whites, which included Blacks, Asian Americans, Latinx, immigrants, and other minority workers. Now, these statistics don't state where these workers were from, so we have to use bits and pieces of information from newspapers, census records, oral histories, and other documents to better understand the lives of African Americans who worked at the Navy Yard. For example, Barbara Tuttle Green, a white woman who worked as a welder at the Navy Yard in 1943, noted in her oral history that she met a lot of Southern Black workers who came to the Navy Yard, since they heard it was hiring and offering good wages. She said, quote, "I talked to one girl, and I guess they were really mistreated terribly down there by the whites. She said that one man was dragged around town on the back end of a car because he had been seen just talking to a white girl. I think that is why a lot of them, when they did come up here to work, they stayed, because they were not mistreated." So Barbara Tuttle Green's observation recognized the 2 main motivations for Southern Blacks moving up north: new economic opportunities and discrimination. Other white and Black workers approached this topic of discrimination at the Charlestown Navy Yard in their oral histories. Some said they didn't see it or experience it, and others talked about discrimination outside of the Navy Yard. While it is true that the institutional structure of the Charlestown Navy Yard did not allow for discrimination, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order banning discrimination in the defense industry, this does not mean there was no discrimination at the Charlestown Navy Yard. What I've learned is that every individual's experience was different, depending on which shop they worked in, who they interacted with, and who their superiors were. This became clear as I looked at discrimination case files by the Fair Employment Practices Committee, or the FEPC. FDR created this committee to investigate discrimination in hiring practices and the workplace. Initially, the FEPC worked under the War Manpower Commission, or the WMC, a commission that was created to manage wartime labor needs, but the FEPC was later moved to the Office of the President. But due to this relationship between the FEPC and the WMC, they ended up working together a lot, so I will be referencing them both. A handful of African Americans submitted discrimination cases against the Charlestown Navy Yard to the FEPC and called for action. J. Henry Strickland, Helen Franklin, and Isaac Cummings were three of these individuals, and they all have varying connections to the Great Migration. While there are still gaps in these individual stories that need to be filled, their experiences with discrimination help us shed light on the racism at the Navy Yard and how African Americans responded to this injustice. So first, we are going to dive into J. Henry Strickland's story, since his life provides us with a great example of a Great Migration story. I'm going to walk through aspects of his life with you, and when we get to Helen and Isaac's stories, I'm actually going to ask you for some help. So J. Henry Strickland grew up in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1910s, and by 16 years old, he was already working. After spending several years as a truck driver, Strickland left Georgia for Massachusetts in 1938. Here he found a temporary part-time work as a house cleaner and janitor. Eventually, he found his way to the Charlestown Navy Yard and started working as a laborer in the rigger shop in June of 1941. By the time he finished his first year at the Navy Yard, he had already received 2 promotions, and he continued looking for ways to advance over the next couple of years. In 1944, Strickland thought he had his chance in seeking to become a mechanic, which he believed would fit his skills and provide him with higher pay. When his efforts proved unsuccessful, in September of 1944, he left his job at the Navy Yard and submitted a case to the FEPC. Strickland stated in his letter, quote, "Each time I asked my master of the shop for my release to go to some other shop where I would have the opportunity to get ahead, I was always refused. He would never give me sensible reason as to why I could not leave. Once he did state that he had to have laborers. I noticed that other workmen with less seniority and less qualifications than I were given the chance to advance. This logically led me to believe that I was being discriminated against." We see from this statement that Strickland firmly believed his superiors discriminated against him due to his race, so he turned to the FEPC for help to fight against this discrimination. When the FEPC investigated Strickland's case, the Navy Yard shared a different story. The lieutenant commander of the Charlestown Navy Yard's Personnel Relations Office said Strickland had an exit interview when he left his job, during which Strickland indicated that the work he had as a laborer was not good for his health. The lieutenant commander confirmed that Strickland had requested a transfer to a mechanical shop, but there were no vacancies at the time. Instead, the Navy Yard offered Strickland with transfers to other departments. However, the lieutenant commander stated Strickland refused the offer since, quote, "He was affected with stomach ulcers and he wanted to seek work of a light nature outside of the yard." So due to Strickland's involuntary decision to leave the Navy Yard, and because his exit interview indicated other reasons for leaving, the FEPC dismissed Strickland's case without merits. So here we see 2 different sides of the story. Strickland made no mention of health reasons for changing his position, yet the Navy Yard does. Considering the limited resources available to us, it's hard to look more into both sides of this story. However, we can look at J. Henry Strickland's Navy personnel file to provide a little more insight. From Strickland's personnel file, we know all of the previous places of employment. It lists the various jobs he had in Atlanta and then in Boston. By looking at that far right-hand corner, you can see that for a couple of these jobs, he left them for a better job. So this notion of looking for better economic opportunities is integral to the story of many Southern Black migrants of the Great Migration. We can see that ever since he arrived in Boston, Strickland had been trying to advance himself. Working at the Navy Yard provided him with one of these opportunities, and asking for a transfer was another. Other documents from his personnel file are employment inquiries sent to Strickland's previous employers when he first applied for the job at the Navy Yard, and they paint a picture of Strickland's work ethic. So first we have Philip Siegel of the Sanford Theater Corporation saying, quote, "I have found him to be thoroughly humble, trustworthy, and efficient. I would recommend him unhesitatingly." Next, we have Sadie Golden, who hired Strickland to do housework, and she said, "To my knowledge, he is well educated, quiet, and very honest. He worked with me 1 day a week and went to school other days or evenings." And then lastly, we have Sophia Hark, who also hired him for housework. She said, quote, "The above worked for me doing housework for about 4 months. I found him honest, a good worker, reliable, and found him respectful. He left my employment for a better position." So what do we notice about all of these statements, and what do they say about Strickland's character? We see words like honest, humble, respectful, reliable all pop up. And it makes us wonder how there's this discrepancy in what he says to the FEPC investigator and what the Navy Yard reports. Also, it begs the question why he wasn't upgraded if his work ethic and dedication were consistently strong. Knowing more about Strickland complicates this case and leaves us with more questions. From what I can find, it appears that once the FEPC concluded the case, J. Henry Strickland looked to other employment opportunities, as he had done many times before, finding a job as a porter for a railroad company. Strickland's life provides us with an example of the Great Migration's connection to the Charlestown Navy Yard, as he saw the Navy Yard as a path for economic advancement. Yet, he also fought back against discrimination at the Yard through the FEPC. While J. Henry Strickland did not push his case forward after its conclusion, the next two individuals took additional steps beyond the FEPC to fight discrimination at the Navy Yard. So next, we're going to be turning to Helen Franklin. Helen Franklin's story provides us with another example of a Southern Black migrant who worked at the Navy Yard during World War II. Franklin was born in South Carolina at the turn of the century and came to Boston with her family as a young girl. She went to high school in Cambridge, and after graduating from high school, she actually returned to the South and worked as a secretary at an institute in North Carolina, and then taught at another industrial institute in Mississippi. Helen Franklin then returned to Boston, and over the course of her life, became involved in various social and political organizations in Boston's Black community. Franklin's unique experience of having moved back and forth between the North and the South must have exposed her to the various forms of discrimination Blacks faced in both areas, and may have prompted her to become involved in the community. And this experience may have also led her to submit a discrimination case against the Navy Yard when she believed she and her colleagues were being discriminated against. On November 6, 1943, Helen Franklin and 11 other women sent a letter to the Fair Employment Practices Committee, notifying it of discrimination in their typist training section in the Yard. Their complaint was twofold. First, they believed their section was being, quote, segregated as a colored group, and that all through the building and offices began whisperings that this was going to be made into a Jim Crow section. They had expressed their concerns to people in charge, but nothing had been done to prove them wrong. Their second complaint was that they were well trained and could be sent to other divisions to do their work. Instead, they had to watch white women get promoted to new positions when their requests for transfers were, quote, refused or ignored. Around the same time Helen Franklin submitted this letter to the FEPC, she also contacted the president of the Boston branch of the NAACP, Julian Steele, about this case. It appears she saw this discrimination as a much larger issue, which she believed deserved the attention from the NAACP. Now, we don't have her initial letter that she sent to Steele, but we do have Julian Steele's response to her letter. He told her, quote, I'm looking into the matter of Jim Crow at the Navy Yard. There have been other complaints besides yours, and I feel that something vigorous should be done to halt this practice. He continued to inform her that he would gladly meet with her and her group, and he would also be contacting the War Manpower Commission and the president of the Boston Urban League, another organization actively standing up for African American employment rights. His response demonstrates that the NAACP was aware of a trend of discrimination at the Navy Yard. Letter exchanges between the Fair Employment Practices Committee and the War Manpower Commission confirmed that they were also looking into several discrimination cases at the time. When Helen Franklin and a couple of her colleagues met to discuss their case with Richard Walker, the Fair Practices Examiner of the WMC, they also spoke about issues Black workers faced at the Navy Yard. Throughout the investigation of Franklin's case, the FEPC and the WMC recorded at least 7 other alleged cases of discrimination at the Navy Yard. They inquired about these cases in Helen Franklin's case to Lieutenant Commander Paul Strecker, the Personnel Relations Officer at the Charlestown Navy Yard, who was tasked with conducting the Navy Yard's investigation. So now, what did the Navy Yard have to say about all of this? And this is where I'm going to ask you for some help. So in March of 1944, a few months after the initial complaint was submitted in November, the War Manpower Commission documented the steps of the investigation thus far and reported it to the Division of Civilian Personnel of the 1st Naval District, essentially the U.S. Navy's regional command and administration for New England. Richard Walker of the WMC and Lieutenant Commander Strecker are frequently appear in this report. So we're going to now do a timeline of events. And so if I can have some volunteers to read some of these, if you don't mind.
December 10th?
Yes, that is, yeah. They're in order, so yeah.
Okay, December 10th, 1943. Mr. Walker held a conference with Commander Paul S. Strucker and discussed the complaints of both the male and female employees. Commander Strucker requested Mr. Walker to submit in writing the specific cases of alleged discrimination, that he would investigate the complaints, and if they were found to be justifiable, adjustments would be made in his own way, and this office would be subsequently notified in writing of his findings and of the action taken.
Okay, so we have this initial meeting about the case, and he's going to be working on this investigation. So next we have January 27th, 1944.
On January 27, 1944, a telephone call was made to Commander Stricter's office inquiring when we might expect an answer to our letter. We were informed that the commander was out, but that he would call this office the next day.
Okay, so a phone call was made and he was unavailable. So now January 28th and 29th.
No call was received on January 28, and on January 29, another call was made to his office. His secretary stated that she had been out sick and had not had a chance to get organized, and promised to call this office on January 31.
Yep, so no response on the 28th. They try again, and they'll get back to you, the investigators. So next, January 31st.
No call was received from the commander's office January 31st.
Yep, no call. And February 3rd, 1944. Made a phone call. He's still working on it, but wait a couple weeks and we'll get it to you. A few weeks passed by, February 19th, 1944.
On February 19th, 1944, Mr. Edward Morand, a field representative for the FEPC, and Mr. Walker visited the Navy Yard and discussed the complaints and inquired when a report could be expected. Commander Strecker stated we should expect it within a week or 10 days.
So that time passes, so they're still working on the report. That time passes, and March 8th, 1944.
To date, no report has been received.
Yep, so clearly, what impressions do you get from this chain of events? Is there anything that jumps out from you? And anyone? Yeah, it seems like they're very hesitant, that they are kind of dragging their feet, it's not a priority for them, and that they keep saying, oh, come back, we'll get it to you, we'll get it to you at some point. And Edward Morand of the FEPC said that it appeared to him that Strecker, quote, had been giving Dick Walker a runaround since December. So finally, on March 13th of 1944, Lieutenant Commander Strecker of the Personnel Relations Office finally responded with his report to the War Manpower Commission. He said, first of all, in response to Helen Franklin's case, he didn't find any individual or group of individuals who expressed prejudice against the women. And then he also stated that the individual cases have been investigated and the personnel relations officer fails to find any cause for any individual feeling discrimination has been employed, since the investigation indicates that in all cases, the instance referred to was either a matter of personal opinion on the part of the complainant or minor personality clashes which may have occurred, which are part of people working together. So what is he saying here? Any thoughts about his conclusion to this investigation? Yeah, so clearly he's saying there's no race discrimination happening here. It's just, one person's opinion versus another person's opinion, that it's just minor personality clashes that you would find in any workplace. There's nothing to see here, essentially. So ultimately, this case was dismissed on merits due to insufficient evidence on April 10th, 1944, roughly 5 months after Helen Franklin and her colleagues submitted their complaint to the FEPC. While the FEPC dismissed the case, it is important to note that the FEPC and WMC investigators remained skeptical of the Navy Yard and the repeated assurance that there was no discrimination. Richard Walker believed that there was probably discrimination at the Yard, but employees could be reluctant to submit cases or have refused to do so for one reason or another. They recognized that the Lieutenant Commander Strecker made everything seem like, quote, hearts and flowers at the Navy Yard, but that probably wasn't the case. And when considering discrimination at the Navy Yard, they stated, quote, we know that it exists, but we cannot prove it. So while Helen Franklin never got the conclusion that she may have hoped for, and ultimately nothing was done, she did help bring awareness to discrimination against African Americans at the Navy Yard, using the FEPC and the NAACP to do so. So lastly, we are going to dive into Isaac Cummings' story to see how his experience with discrimination at the Navy Yard differed from the previous 2 cases and also ignited his community. Now, currently we know very little about Cummings, only that he was a World War II veteran, having served in the Army, and that he previously worked as a Navy Yard guard. At the time of the event, Cummings was working as a driller at the South Boston Annex of the Charlestown Navy Yard. Now, in January 1945, Isaac Cummings was accused of, quote, refusing to obey the order of and assaulting or resisting a Navy Yard police officer or officers. He received this accusation a couple days after an altercation with 5 Navy Yard guards. So what happened in this case? The FEPC investigators' report shared the Navy Yard's account of the event, as investigated by Lieutenant Commander Strecker, the personnel relations officer, and the same officer involved in Helen Franklin's case. According to Strecker, Cummings got his lunch at the cafeteria, and when he sat down, he realized he forgot his silverware. He got back up and passed the line to get his silverware, and supposedly ignored a guard, Sergeant Bradley, who questioned what Cummings was doing. When Cummings was seated back at his table, the officer went up to Cummings and asked for his identification card. Allegedly, Cummings refused to show his card after being asked repeatedly to do so. The officer called for the police wagon to come. Once the driver and another officer arrived, they once again asked Cummings for his identification. When Cummings refused, the officers informed him they would have to bring him to the security officer. While they removed Cummings from his seat, allegedly, Cummings swung at the officers and pushed one into a table. The officers fought back by beating Cummings on the head with their nightsticks. They got Cummings under control and took him to the security officer before taking him to the Navy Yard Infirmary and finally the city hospital. The lieutenant commander said he interviewed both black and white workers who witnessed the event, and they gave, quote, fairly parallel accounts of what happened. Additionally, the lieutenant commander stated Cummings requested a hearing to debate his suspension for disobeying orders. Cummings did not appear on the agreed-upon hearing date and was suspended for 10 days. So hearing this account of the event provided by the Navy Yard supports the disciplinary action against Isaac Cummings. However, if we add Isaac Cummings' side of the story, we get a very different picture of what happened. Cummings asserted that when he got up to get his silverware and the officer questioned him, Cummings told Sergeant Bradley what he was doing. When Bradley came up to Cummings' table and asked Cummings to see his identification, Cummings stated that he did present his identification badge. However, Cummings admitted he had questioned Bradley as to why he wanted to see this identification. Since Cummings had previously worked as a Navy Yard guard, he knew it was against the rules for an officer to ask to see a worker's badge unless they were entering or leaving the yard, or if there was a reason to think someone was suspicious. Cummings said Bradley did not respond to his inquiry, and he left. And then a few minutes later, he returned with 4 other guards. According to Cummings, Bradley instructed these guards to remove him from the cafeteria. Next, Bradley and the guards made the first move by grabbing him out of his seat and striking him on his head with their nightsticks. Cummings described how he tried to defend himself from the blows, only to be repeatedly attacked by the guards and Bradley. As they pushed and shoved him out of the building to take him to the police barracks, Cummings said, quote, "Guard Poole pulled his revolver and told the workers to stand back or he would fire." Cummings then described being taken to the police barracks and meeting with the yard's police captain, who then took him to the infirmary. He was then taken to the hospital. Now, Cummings believed this attack was unprovoked, since he did show his badge when Sergeant Bradley requested to see it. Now, the last paragraph of Cummings' statement adds another interesting perspective of the situation. Cummings says, quote, "Personally, I am of the opinion that Sergeant Bradley, who is reported to be a Southerner, has resented the presence of colored workers in the Navy Yard. I have heard on previous occasions that he had had run-ins with colored workers, and on a recent occasion, it was reported that he beat up a colored sailor, and the matter was hushed up. I am also of the opinion that the assault made upon me was unprovoked and was done only because of my being a Negro." So is there anything that jumps out at you in this statement? Yep. So it's this whole idea that not only were Southern black migrants moving up north, but there are also a lot of white Southerners moving up north. And so there's this idea that with these Southern white workers, that Jim Crow was coming up north with them. And you see that in a lot of discussion at different shipyards across the country. And then we can also see that in both occasions that this tension is increasing between these two men. And so it was going to erupt in violence. So when we look at the FEPC's investigators' notes, they further complicate these initial statements made by the Navy Yard. So earlier I had mentioned Lieutenant Commander Strecker told the investigator that Cummings didn't show up for his hearing. However, when the investigator interviewed Cummings and inquired why he did not appear for his hearing, Cummings stated that he was sick on the date of his hearing and called the Lieutenant Commander's office the morning of that hearing. Cummings said he spoke to the Lieutenant Commander's secretary, quote, "who said she would give him the message." The investigator asked Strecker about this phone call, and Strecker said that there was no report of this phone call. So once again, we are left wondering who to believe, Strecker or Cummings. The investigator also reviewed the witness statements of Lieutenant Commander Took of the event. While he agreed that these statements were largely similar, the investigator wrote in his report, quote, "but it was indicative that the Negro witnesses as a group felt that what had transpired was not quite necessary, and they all felt the situation could have been handled in a much more intelligent and peaceful manner." Now, this statement hints at the sentiments of fellow black workers at the Navy Yard and their disagreement with how the guards approached the situation. They were not the only ones who shared this view. As more and more people heard about this violent attack, the community began to show their support for Cummings. So we're going to take a look now at a few examples of this support, and we'll talk about what stands out to you.
Richard H. Walker, our minorities representative, has received, within the past 5 days, numerous telephone calls and personal visits from both white and Negro citizens who have expressed themselves as being highly indignant of the way and manner in which Cummings was treated by the 5 guards. Mr. Cummings has also been in this office. Regional Director, War Manpower Commission, February 2nd, 1945.
Great, thanks. And then now we're going to turn to a couple newspapers. So the Boston Chronicle from January 27th.
Hitleristic savagery was truly demonstrated last Tuesday at the South Boston Navy Yard cafeteria when 5 Navy Yard policemen used their clubs to pummel Isaac Cummings, a driller, into total unconsciousness. Cummings, who is a World War II veteran and an ex-Navy Yard policeman, was given a taste of un-American and Nazi brutality by men who were his ex-fellow employees.
Thank you. And then February 17th, also from the Boston Chronicle.
Lieutenant Commander Walton Hall Smith, acting head of Employee Relations Branch, Navy Department, Washington, has assured the editors of the Chronicle that the brutal beating allegedly inflicted upon Isaac Cummings, World War II veteran, is being thoroughly probed. His assurance came in response to a telegram dispatched by the editors to the Secretary of the Navy, James V. Forrestal. Protests against the incidents have been set by both Negro and white individuals and organizations to Secretary Forrestal, Senator David G. Walsh, Chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee of the Senate, and Senator Leverett Saltonstall. Boston Chronicle, February 17, 1945.
Great, thank you. And now we're going to switch to the Baltimore Afro-American from February 3rd.
Among employees at the South Boston Navy Yard and throughout the city over the brutal attack January 23rd upon Isaac Cummings, a driller and World War II veteran, by 5 Navy Yard policemen. The local NAACP and other organizations are investigating the matter, and the editor of the Boston Chronicle sent a telegram to the Secretary of the Navy, James V. Forrestal, requesting immediate investigation because feeling was high in the yard. The attack so angered white and colored workers that the officers threatened to use their riot guns to hold them off. February 3rd, 1945.
Great, thank you. And then lastly, from Afro-American on February 10th.
Isaac Cummings, who was brutally beaten by 5 policemen at the South Boston Navy Yard on January 23rd for returning for additional silverware in the cafeteria, shown as he appeared this week, still unable to return to his job. Near riot conditions prevail at the yard, observers say. Baltimore Afro-American, February 10th, 1945.
Great, thank you. So what impressions do you get from for the statement and then all these newspaper articles? So it really sounds like the community is up in arms about this, and then talking about this Hitleristic savagery and un-American and Nazi-like brutality, that people were coming to the War Manpower Commission wanting to speak up against this injustice at the Navy Yard. So you would think that with all of this going on, that it would kind of help the Navy Yard do something about this. And interestingly enough, that none of the other Boston papers talk about this event, and not even the Navy Yard's own newspaper talked about this. So we noticed that this case is drastically different from Strickland's and Franklin's cases due to the violent nature of this discrimination. With all of this public support to investigate this discrimination and violent act against Isaac Cummings, we unfortunately don't know what happened to this case. There's no final conclusive report by the FEPC. In the archives, this case is listed as an active case of the Fair Employment Practices Committee, meaning it was still open when the committee dissolved in 1946. So hearing these stories about J. Henry Strickland, Helen Franklin, and Isaac Cummings' experience at the Navy Yard, we can return to that question about whether Southern African Americans who came to Boston truly fled discrimination as some of them had hoped. Southern Black migrants could find new economic opportunities through employment at the Navy Yard, yet some still face discrimination. While we may be used to hearing stories of teamwork, service, and patriotism at the Charlestown Navy Yard, the stories of these individuals show the diverse experiences of workers at the Charlestown Navy Yard. These workers, who wanted to contribute to the war effort to help their country, recognized the irony of fighting against injustice abroad when prejudice existed at home. Now, I would like to end with the line from Helen Franklin and her colleagues' letter that embodies this sentiment felt by some African Americans who face discrimination at the Navy Yard. They say, "Inasmuch as we are requested to give our lives in the service, our money for bonds, and since we have never failed to show our loyalty and patriotism, we feel that something should be done about this particular kind of prejudice and discrimination." Thank you. So now I'd be happy to take any questions you have. Yes.
What do we know about the lieutenant commander's history?
So I've been trying to track him down, but it's very hard to. The Navy Yard's papers are scattered, and there are lots of gaps, especially around World War II. And what I have found in a previous historian's book is that Lieutenant Commander Paul Strecker was known as a salesman of the Navy Yard. He was trying to recruit a lot of workers. So my theory is that if he were to admit that there was discrimination, how is he going to get more workers for the workforce at the Navy Yard? And so I guess he went to a conference once and described himself as a salesman to try and get employ people at the Navy Yard. So other than that, I haven't been able to track him down. It's also interesting that there are no records of how many African Americans, let alone minorities, how many were working in the Navy Yard prior to the World War II. That there's, looking at some records or reading this one historian who wrote a history of the Navy Yard in the 1890s, gave an example of one African American, said there's at least one other, but we don't really know. And then talking in the 40s, they say that there's ideas that there was a very, very small number of African Americans employed at the Navy Yard prior to the World Wars, and that it was really this need for the workforce to help with the defense industry since it was, booming with the war. They reached out to the African American community, and you can see that there are advertisements from the government in local black papers calling on people to enter the Navy Yard. Oh, there's like 50,000 people working at the Navy Yard and during World War II. Yeah.
What kind of newspaper was the Boston Chronicle?
So the Boston Chronicle is one of the local black newspapers. So it's the Boston Chronicle and the Boston Guardian. Even the Boston Guardian did not talk about this, which I think is very interesting, that it was only one of the newspapers that discussed this case. But yeah, Boston Globe, the Boston Traveler, the Boston Herald, none of the other papers mention it. And it was interesting. The only way I found the Baltimore Afro-American is that I was looking through a database of historically black newspapers, and it just popped up those a couple articles, but no other newspapers I've been able to find this mentioned. So a lot of this is from the Fair Employment Practices Committee case files. I also looked at the War Manpower Commission, their files, that all of those are located at National Archives in Waltham. But to find more information about the individuals themselves, for Henry Strickland, I was able to track down, census records and city records to find out more about him, and that's how I found out that afterwards he found a job as a porter. And I haven't been able to confirm, but I think I also found that he may have eventually moved to Canada later in his life, but I haven't been able to confirm that yet. Helen Franklin has been another research path. I happened to come across this letter when I was looking it through Julian D. Steele's collection. Since there's not much literature about the Navy Yard and the Great Migration, I was trying to think of other individuals that may be talking about discrimination at the Navy Yard, which led me to think about, well, the local NAACP might be talking about discrimination. So I was searching through his records in stacks of hundreds of papers, and then I just found this letter written to Helen Franklin. And I knew it was her because talking about discrimination at the Navy Yard, same name, and I found a couple other letters that she had sent to him that kind of further describes her a little bit more. And so that was one way that I was able to flesh out her story. And I've done a whole bunch of more research on her, tracking her down, and her story is fascinating. And just to kind of tied into my other work that I'm doing is that I'm creating some digital projects to share some of these stories. So creating digital story maps that will then show the lives of Helen Franklin and Henry Strickland, how the Great Migration played a part of their lives and how the Navy Yard was a very small portion, that they actually did a lot more than just the Navy Yard. In terms of Helen Franklin, she helped start the Cambridge Community Center. She was involved in the NAACP, in the Boston Urban League, and in several other local Black organizations. I haven't come across anything to that extent. I think in oral histories, you could say there are people saying how, some individuals weren't happy, but, they got used to it after a while. But to what extent they showed their dislike, I don't know about that. Actually, I have, not living in this area. So Helen Franklin, so I'll talk a little bit more of how I traced her down. The hard part with tracking down a woman is because that's, if they got married, then it's hard to track down what their maiden name was and to find out their stories before they got married. And so for Helen Franklin, I eventually found out through looking at Julian D. Steele's collection that her maiden name was Lee, and that led me to look into some, I thought I found some census records, but I wasn't sure. I found a newspaper article mentioning her nephew. And so after a while, I realized I could use the nephew to connect the dots, eventually confirming that she was born in the South, and eventually leading me to an obituary for her. So doing more research, a couple weeks ago recently, I was trying to figure out how could I find if any descendants of Helen's existed or were still living. And she had no children, so I then turned to her siblings. And one of her siblings was Blanche, who was the mother of this nephew. And so I looked into some of her children and found an obituary for her eldest son, Harry Elam, who was actually he was the first African-American judge of the Superior Court in Massachusetts. And he was very instrumental. He was a very important judge and, very impressive figure on his own. And so I found in his obituary that he had a couple of relatives still alive, one of which was Annette Elam Thomas, who is actually a former ambassador to Senegal from 2000 to 2002. So a couple of weeks ago, I was trying to find different ways to reach out to her, and she was, I think, like 17 years younger than her elder siblings. So I don't think any of her siblings are still alive today. And I tracked her down at some point, and she responded to me saying, "Yes, Helen Franklin is my aunt, and I would love to know more about her," because she was 9 years old when Helen Franklin passed away. So I was able to share with her some of the research, and that was only last week, so I haven't heard back from her yet. But as for these other individuals, I've been trying to track down anyone related to Henry Strickland and haven't been able to do so. Isaac Cummings, his story drops off right after this. I haven't been able to find anything more about him. He may have moved to South Carolina because there's an Isaac Cummings buried in the National Cemetery in Beaufort, but I haven't been able to confirm that is him, just with the amount of information we have about him. So right now, we only know that he was where he was living at the time of this attack, and through that, I was able to find his rough age by looking at a city record or a list of records for addresses, and it listed his age next to him. So all I know is where he was living and how old he is. Other than that, I haven't been able to confirm where he was from and where he moved to after this. Yes, the March on Washington, led by Booker T. Washington, was essentially threatening FDR to do something, and that's what led him to sign the executive order and create the Fair Employment Practices Committee to try and quiet them down. And so it was initially under the War Manpower Commission, but then there was a lot of people saying that it was ineffective, and the War Manpower Commission was cutting down on the funding for the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which then eventually led FDR to move the FEPC under the Office of the President. And slowly, by the end of the war, though, money was being taken away from it. Lots of the different headquarters for the FEPC were all shutting down across the country, and until ultimately Boston was shut down in 1946. And so, it was over only, I believe, 1/4 of all FEPC cases had a sufficient conclusion to the cases. And so it was not as effective as a lot of people were hoping it would be. There are 8 cases at the Boston Navy Yard, the Charlestown Navy Yard, and 7 of them were dismissed, and then the last one being Isaac Cummings that remained active. So the Massachusetts tried starting up its own FEPC through the years afterwards, but largely the FEPC wasn't as effective as a lot of people were hoping it was going to be.